All right, let me begin with a quick story. This happens every September at the University of Chicago, out in Illinois. The university asks a professor, a different faculty member every year to give their annual Aims of Education address to the incoming freshmen. And as the name implies, it's just a lecture to these 18-year-olds about what they can expect there at the University of Chicago during their 4 years. Well, a few years ago, they asked a distinguished professor of political science to give this address. And he identified for these freshmen various aims of education, things like critical thinking and broadening intellectual horizons and improving their self-awareness, and pretty standard stuff and pretty important stuff. But then, interestingly, he went on to identify what he called two non-aims of education there. Two things that they're intentionally not trying to do at the university. The first non-aim of education, he said, was providing truth. Providing truth. His exact quote was this: "We expect you to figure out the truth if there is one." Now, time out for a second. Anybody have any idea what it costs to attend the University of Chicago for 1 year? Tuition, room and board, books, and fees? Any idea? You're probably guessing too low. I can't quite hear you, but I looked this up. For the average student, 1 year, undergrad, $63,861. $64,000. And it kind of raises the question, can't we get in our universities at least a little bit of truth for 64 grand? It's kind of the modern day version of the $64,000 question. Those of you under 40 have no idea what I'm talking about. Anyway, the first non-aim of education, he said, was providing truth. The second non-aim, he said, was moral guidance. His exact quote was this: "The university makes hardly any effort to provide you with moral guidance. You'll take few classes here at Chicago where you discuss ethics or morality in any detail, mainly because those kinds of courses do not exist." The classes don't exist at any price. Why wouldn't they exist at one of the top academic institutions in the country? And by the way, I don't mean to pick on the University of Chicago. This exact same address could have been delivered at literally thousands of colleges and universities across the Western world. But why don't these classes exist on ethics and moral guidance and character and so on? Well, I think some of you probably know the answer. It's moral relativism. It's postmodernism. It's the dominant social philosophy of our day. This professor's message to these young 18-year-olds was clear. He said, these are important questions. Truth and guidance and character and whom we should be, all those. These are important questions, but you decide what's right and what's wrong. You decide what's good and what's not good. You set the standard. Now, that doesn't mean that the university permits cheating or plagiarism or harassment, but when it does regulate those things, it needs to be careful because it's kind of slouching toward moral guidance. But notwithstanding, as far as what kind of person you should become, about what the good life is, about the kind of people that we should be, how we should live our lives, they'll steer clear of those questions at this university because, and here's the point for us today, who's to say what's good? In 2014, who's to say what's good? There's no objective answer. And in the absence of an objective answer, we can turn to all kinds of places for our standards. We can look to ourselves, our feelings, and what's in my best interest. We can look to our friends and emulate their values and their behaviors. We could look to Dr. Phil, and we can look to Dr. Oz, and we could look to Dr. Oprah. We could look to other celebrities. How many marriages is it appropriate to have in 50 years? We could look to athletes. Is it okay for me to use performance-enhancing drugs in high school? We could look to music lyrics. We could look to our teachers. We could look to our pastors. We could look to television. We could look to movies for our standards. We could look to the ubiquitous advertisements out there that imply that the good life is about having more, that happiness, have more of it if you just open up your wallet. That beauty is something that you buy. Notice there's no objectivity in any of this, no standard that applies across the board, because after all, who's to say what's good? Well, in a place like Hope Community Church, on a Sunday morning, sitting in these pews, the answer is pretty obvious. The answer, it's almost trite to say it. Well, it's God who decides what's good. It's God who's the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong, of good and bad, of truth and untruth. And I think we kind of know that, but even believers struggle with this. There's all kinds of survey evidence out there. The Barna Research Group did a study of born-again believers a few years ago. And what they found was that only 1 in 3 adults, it was a study in the United States, only 1 in 3 adults who identify as born-again believers believe in moral absolutes, good as defined by God. Only 1 in 3. And when you look at born-again teenagers, that number is a scant 1 in 10. So who determines what's right and what's good? In how we speak, in how we dress, in how we respond to conflict, in what we buy, and how much we spend, and how we use our time, and what we do at work, and what we do in our private life, and how we drive. Who determines what's good? Well, the answer for many of us, if not most of us, is that we do. And I think it's in large part because we've been marinated in this culture that essentially says we are autonomous, that we decide that we need to look out for number one and we need to make the call. Which brings us to our Bible story for today, our Bible lesson for today. And you turn there if you'd like, but the verses will be on the screen. We're going to look at a little bit in the book of 1 Samuel. It's a major turning point in the Old Testament. See, Samuel was Israel's leader at the time. This is the 11th century BC. He was what they call a judge. And this isn't in the black robe sense. This is a judge who is a deliverer, a warrior, a protector. Gideon was a judge. I think he just went through a study of Gideon here in this church. Samson was a judge. These are strong, charismatic leaders who kept Israel safe. But at some point, the people come to Samuel, the judge at the time, the deliverer at the time, and they say, you know what, Samuel? Thanks for the memories, but we don't want you judges anymore. We want a king to rule over us. Well, why'd they want a king? They wanted a king because all the other nations around them had a king. Come on, Samuel. Everybody's doing it. Tell God we need a king. The Amalekites have a king, and the Ammonites have a king, and the Moabites, and the Edomites, and the Perizzites, and the termites. They all have kings. We want a king too. Then we'll be like all of these other nations. Samuel says to them, this is a bad idea. You do not want a king. A king is going to take your land. A king's going to take the best of your crops. A king's going to take your sons for his service in the army. He's going to take your daughters for his service as his cooks and his bakers. This is a bad idea. Samuel, we want a king. Tell God we need a king. That would be good. So Samuel goes to God and says they want a king. And God reassures him. They've not rejected you, Samuel. They've rejected me. They want an earthly king because they have rejected me as their king. So give them their king. Let them decide what's good, and we'll see what happens. And it turns out to be an abysmal decision as they get their first king, a guy named Saul. And King Saul starts out humbly enough, but then pride seems to take over. Plus, the guy wasn't exactly the brightest bulb in the pack. One time he decided, to motivate my army, I'm going to starve them. Nobody eats until we defeat the enemy. All right? Nobody eats until we win the battle. Maybe some of you have bosses like that. And nobody eats lunch or dinner until this project is completed. It was a stupid strategy then. It's a stupid strategy now. Don't do that if you're a manager. But a little free consulting advice there. It's about all it's worth. But the point is, he wasn't exactly the brightest guy sometimes. And actually, another time, he decided that he was going to offer up the priestly sacrifices on the battlefield rather than waiting for a priest to do it. Right? No priest around? No problem. I'll prepare the burnt offering. That would be a good idea. It was not a good idea. Right? In fact, we may not really appreciate this in our day and age, but a burnt offering wasn't just something served up by a lousy cook. All right, a burnt offering in those days was how people showed dependence on God, and people showed repentance, and people petitioned God through the sacrifice of bulls and sheep and goats and birds, depending on their socioeconomic status. So Saul prepares this burnt offering. God had ordained this, that it be done a particular way by a particular person, specifically by the priests. So in cultural context, Saul's unauthorized sacrifice would be foolish, even disobedient, and he knew better. It was intentionally done. It's kind of hard to come up with analogies in our day and age because we don't do these sorts of things anymore, but it's almost like we just had a healthcare discussion here. It's almost like imagine that you need major surgery, and instead of a surgeon doing it, your insurance agent comes to you and says, you know what, to save time and money, I'm going to do the surgery. And who knows, it may actually come to that someday, I don't know. But, Ralph, step away from the anesthesia and the scalpel and get back to your laptop. But we know that's not the way to get healthier. Just like Saul knew that this was not the way to petition God and to relate to God when he took matters into his own hands. And so Samuel comes to him and says this, you've done a foolish thing, Saul. You've done a foolish thing. You've not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom won't endure. He sought out a man after his own heart. He's talking about the future King David here. And appointed him ruler over his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. You insist on redefining what's good, Saul. You insist on doing things your way. You prepared the burnt offering? Well, I'm preparing a pink slip for you. Did Saul learn his lesson? Well, not exactly, because a mere 2 chapters later, Samuel tells him, God wants you to wipe out the Amalekites. Wipe them out, all the people, all the animals, all their possessions, for reasons that we don't have time to get into here. But he specifically tells him this, go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Wipe them out. And Saul actually complies. He goes and he does this, except he spares the Amalekite king, and he spares their sheep, and he spares their cattle. And so he kind of changed the mission a little bit. And so Samuel comes back to check on Saul's progress, and we see this. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul. But he's told, Saul's gone to Carmel. There he set up a monument in his own honor. Great, I got to go see this. So Samuel goes there, and Saul greets him very warmly. He says, Lord bless you, I've carried out the Lord's instructions. Oh, you've carried out the Lord's instructions to wipe out everything? Then why do I hear this bleating of sheep in my ears? What then is this lowing of cattle that I hear? This is funny. Actually, it would be funny if it weren't so sad. We have Saul responding here. It was the soldiers who did it. The soldiers decided that they were going to bring them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep, but we totally destroyed the rest. You see, Saul had an answer here. The guys thought that this would be a good idea, to keep them for sacrifices and such. Isn't that a good idea? And Samuel said, no, that's not a good idea. In fact, Samuel excoriates him. I'll tell you what's a good idea, Monument Man. Obeying the Lord would be a good idea. Did you ever consider that? Listening to God would be a good idea. God said do A, and you did B. Actually, that's a bit of a paraphrase. You see what Samuel actually says here. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than to sacrifice, because you've rejected the word of the Lord. He's rejected you as king. And then, and only then, does Saul fess up. I've sinned. I've violated the Lord's commands and your instructions. Why? And this is very important. Right? I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them. Now, notice something about these stories. Who's deciding what's good here? In all of these stories, Israel decided what was good. The people of Israel decided, and they wanted a king. And King Saul decided what was good, and so he offered the burnt offering. He prepared the burnt offering. And then he allowed the men to decide what was good, and so he changed God's mission. Right? In none of these cases did the people actually go to God to decide what was good. It's almost as if they were not taking God seriously. I don't know, maybe it's that Aims of Education address that they heard at Jerusalem State University. But regardless, this is a problem that's as old as the human race. Right? Eve looked to a snake to decide what was good, and she reached for that apple. Cain looked to his feelings to decide what was good, and he decided to kill his brother Abel. Samson looked to Delilah to determine what was good, and then he compromised himself. Judas Iscariot, PhD, looked to the Pharisees to decide what was good, and looked to his own logic to decide what was good. And then he handed over Jesus. And you fast forward a couple of millennia, and we too are prone to ignoring God when deciding what's good, maybe even more so than our predecessors because of this incessant cultural conditioning. Well, what can we take away from this message? A couple of practical things that we might be able to take away for use this week. Let me suggest three things. First of all, we can't decide what's good. We can't decide what's good. When we set the standard for what's good, bad things can happen. Why? Because we can rationalize anything. I got something in my inbox a few weeks ago from a company whose tagline is, "Life is short, have an affair." Life is short, have an affair. All kinds of nefarious stuff shows up in the inbox of a middle-aged guy. But how is it that this company is in business? Now, for a fee, they arrange these trysts among married people. How is it that a company like this is in business? Because people will rationalize it. They'll pay the fee, right, because of whatever is going on at home. When we set the standard for what's good, bad things can happen. I saw a news story whose headline was this: Georgia man runs into burning home to get beer. Georgia man runs into burning home to get beer. Apparently, 6 adults and 2 kids were in that house watching TV. The house starts filling with smoke, and they bolt out of there. And then one guy, I don't know, maybe his name was Saul, decided to bolt right back in there to retrieve his beer. He later told the news reporter that he went back inside, quote, like a dummy, and the door shut behind him. But then he was able to escape without getting burned, and he managed to save several cans of beer. Hallelujah. Now, when we set the standard for what's good, bad things can happen. But on a more serious note, when I was in seminary at a place called Yale Divinity School up in Connecticut, I'd sometimes go to this prayer room, and it was about half the size of this platform, about the space for one person in there. And there was a kneeler and a large print Bible. And you could pray, and you could read Scripture and communicate with God however you'd like. But as you flip through that Bible, you find a number of places where students have actually lined out verses that they didn't like, and crossed out words and changed words that did not quite comport with their worldview. This is in a seminary. Right? When we set the standard for what's good, bad things can happen. Here's the second practical lesson. We can't be good by trying to be good, at least not for very long. And this one may be very liberating for a number of you. It may be the most important thing you hear in this message, especially if you're exhausted, you're frustrated, you're disappointed, you're discouraged from all the trying and trying and trying to be more patient and to be more joyful and to be more compassionate and to be more self-controlled with what you say and with what you eat and with what you spend and what you look at and various other things. If you are exhausted from trying so hard and finding that this has no staying power, let me suggest that you stop beating yourself up over falling so short, over all this trying and trying and trying and failing and failing and failing. All that does is engender guilt and alienation from God. That's not how we make progress. And that's certainly not the abundant life that Jesus died to give us. We can't be good by trying to be good. There's a better way. Well, what's that better way? It's the third practical lesson for today. We can't do this on our own. All right, and I think that is by design. If you're tired of this Christianity light stuff, if you're tired of going through the motions, if you're tired of 2 steps forward only to take 2 steps back, let me suggest that you get a spiritually mature friend to come alongside of you as an accountability partner, as an encouragement partner, as somebody who will ask you the tough questions, how are you doing and what are you doing, and support you, build you up, encourage you when you're feeling guilty about falling short or not being able to measure up to the standards. You see, when we're accountable only to ourselves, we're basically accountable to no one. We can't do this on our own. And relatedly, and even more importantly, make God your accountability and encouragement partner. I have to remind myself of this all the time. It's the fruit of His Spirit that's goodness, not the fruit of our own efforts. Ask God for help with patience and joy and love and compassion and goodness and living by His standards, and He'll help us with this. Well, how does that happen? How do we achieve more goodness? That's a whole series in and of itself. But the short answer is that it's basically the flip side of how we lose it. We lose it when we're alienated from God. We lose it when we're distracted from God. We lose it when we're walking away from God. We gain it when we're restoring that relationship, when we're making it more of a priority, when we're pursuing more of God, when we're reordering our life around God rather than around social media or video games or work or television or our own popularity or whatever it is that is occupying our mind. This is a theme that really transcends this series. Right? The closer we are to God, the more that seeking His standards becomes more or less an automatic response to the decisions of the day, rather than some sort of choked down choice. We're not meant to do this on our own. Let me close with this. In preparation for this message, I interviewed briefly a student I know from the University of Chicago. There he is, right there. This is, I've chosen to keep him anonymous, but this is a real picture of him reading his abstract algebra book on the beach for fun this summer. He's not even taking the course. All right? These are smart kids, really smart. And so I asked him, I said, well, what happens when a student in class or in your dormitory or in the student center, you get in some sort of discussion, what happens when somebody argues that something's right? Morally right, not mathematically right. What happens in that situation? Somebody says something's right or wrong. And very quickly he chuckled and said, there's always somebody who's going to jump all over that with, hey, who's to say what's right? And so I followed up. I said, well, what if they offer some sort of faith-based reason for something is right or wrong, something rooted in Christianity or Islam or say Judaism? What happens then? And his response was very telling. He said, students might politely respect that, but they won't be convinced. He said that since there are so many religions, there's no way to know whether any of them are right. And besides, most students don't think they need religious belief. They don't think they need any kind of religion or faith because they can be good people without it. And so it is that we achieve our aims of education. My point is that we are raising up a generation of relativists here, of essentially self-reliant agnostics, of autonomous people who set the standard for good and bad, for right and wrong, for truth and for untruth. But my further point is this isn't the first generation. In fact, there have been several generations. In fact, probably every one of us in this room and every one of us listening online has been affected by this spirit of autonomy to one extent or another, just by virtue of having lived in this sort of culture and been bombarded by all of these cultural messages. And if we think that we're not affected, that may be the surest sign that we are. This week, as you go about your normal routines, do some self-assessment, watch yourself, and maybe even ask somebody else to help you with this, some sort of accountability and encouragement partner. How is it that I'm making my decisions? What is it that are the standards that I'm using? When I drive, when I'm working, when I'm shopping, when I'm engaged in a leisure activity, when I'm under duress, when I'm in the middle of some sort of conflict, when somebody cuts me off, when there's some kind of injustice. What are my standards for right and wrong? Where are they coming from? Are they coming from me? Are they coming from society? Or are they coming from a better source? And beyond that, consider making a decision, maybe right now, that this week you'll intentionally lean on God for that standard of goodness. and see what he does with that.